Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Baker Institute. It's my great pleasure to welcome you here tonight. We are truly delighted to have one of our nation's most distinguished diplomats with us for this evening's program. As Assistant Secretary of State for South and Central Asian Affairs, he oversees United States diplomacy across the vast region, which encompasses India, a rising power of more than 1 billion citizens, the energy-rich Caspian states, the former Soviet Union, as well as Afghanistan and Pakistan, among others. He does not shirk difficult jobs. Our interests in South and Central Asia are compelling. They include promoting security and stability in Afghanistan and Pakistan, further enhancing ties between the United States and India, seeking greater economic prosperity, and strengthening democratic forms of government around this critical region. In the past few years, the U.S.-India relationship has grown closer than ever before, and India's rapid economic growth has been positive for both the region and the world. However, the subcontinent is still home to two nuclear powers, Pakistan and India, with unresolved territorial disputes that have led to significant wars since the end of British rule in the late 1940s. I do not doubt the great challenge our policymakers like Bob Blake have of adopting a regional approach to conflict resolution. But it is well worth considering as the President and his advisors assess the future of U.S. policy in South and Central Asia, that a regional approach is probably imperative. If the United States is to succeed, we must call upon the very best of our diplomats, as well as our formidable military might. Our speaker this evening has much to say on these and other important subjects. The only bad thing in his CV is that he had to work for me at one point in his career. He entered the Foreign Service, he's a youngster, in 1985, after earning a BA from Harvard College. We will forgive you for that, Ed Rice, and a master's degree in international relations from the School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins University. He has served at the American embassies in Tunisia, Algeria, Nigeria, and Egypt. He has also held a number of important positions at the State Department in Washington, including the Senior Desk Officer for Turkey, Deputy Executive Secretary and Executive Assistant to the Undersecretary for Political Affairs. He served as Deputy Chief of Mission at the U.S. Embassy in New Delhi, India from 2003 to 2006, and then was appointed United States Ambassador to Sri Lanka and the Maldives from 2006 to mid-2009. Since May of 2009, he has been the Assistant Secretary of State for South and Central Asian Affairs. So please join me in welcoming my friend and colleague, Assistant Secretary Robert Blake.
Well, thank you, Ed, for that very kind introduction. As Ed said, I did have the privilege of working for him at one point, and that probably marked the high point of my Foreign Service career. It's been all downhill ever since. I'm always amused to hear somebody read my bio because it's something that only a Washington bureaucrat could love, you know, deputy assistant to the assistant to the assistant first. But in fact, somewhere in there, some real work was actually done. I really want to thank Ed for inviting me to come here today. It's really a pleasure to get out of Washington and talk to real people. And you know, we're always encouraged to do domestic outreach. When I told people I was coming to Texas, they said, "That's not domestic outreach." Texas has a little bit of a special place in Washington. But in all seriousness, I think I have been so pleased to see the tremendous progress that Ed and Secretary Baker have made to build this institute into really one of the premier public policy and think tanks in the country now. And it's really a pleasure to see that. And so I was very happy to accept Ed's invitation to come down here. And you know, we have a lot of interest here. There's a big Indian American community, a big Pakistani American community, some Sri Lankans, a lot of oil interests. I'll be meeting with a lot of the oil companies tomorrow to talk about some of the important work that they're doing in various parts of my region. But I thought what I would do today is just kind of offer a very brief review of South and Central Asia with a particular emphasis on the issues of importance to Houston. You know, I deal primarily with a region that spans from Sri Lanka in the south all the way up to Kazakhstan and the steppes of Kazakhstan in the far, far north. From the tiny little islands of the Maldives, which are east of Sri Lanka or west of Sri Lanka, all the way up to the little mountain state of Bhutan. And then I work very closely with the special representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan, the late Richard Holbrooke, who was really a great friend and colleague. And Secretary Clinton is now thinking about who can possibly replace such a giant figure in American diplomacy. For many Americans, this part of the world that I work in is primarily defined by the challenges that we face in Afghanistan and Pakistan. But it's also a region of tremendous growth and opportunity. Central Asia is at a critical strategic crossroads for the United States, bordering Afghanistan, China, Russia, and Iran, which is why the United States wants to continue to expand our engagement and our cooperation with this critical region. And South Asia, with India as its thriving anchor, is a region of growing strategic and commercial importance to the United States in the critical Indian Ocean region. In total, the region is home to over 2 billion people, roughly 1/4 of the world's population. It's incredibly diverse, ranging from the crowded metropolises of India and Bangladesh to the vast unpopulated steppes of Kazakhstan. The Silk Road once linked the South and Central Asian region through an extensive trade network. Cultural and political linkages came later. Timur, whose legacy still holds very strong in Uzbekistan, established a strong cultural link between these regions in the late 14th century, when his armies conquered Multan in present-day Pakistan and then Delhi. He planted the seeds for the powerful Mughal dynasty that would later go on to produce such cultural marvels as the Taj Mahal. Today, this region is one of the least integrated in the world, as unfortunately I experience every time I have to travel there, because I find that to go from one Central Asian region country to another, I usually have to go through Moscow or Istanbul or some other far-flung capital to get to the other one. So that's a small illustration of some of the progress that needs to be made. With rapidly growing economies like India, emerging markets like Bangladesh and Kazakhstan, resource-rich countries like Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan, greater linkages in this region would bring tremendous benefits to its citizens and to the world. There are some nascent efforts underway, such as the Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, India pipeline, that will help to promote greater regional linkages, and I'll come back to TAPI in a minute. First, let me just talk about some of the key administration priorities. We have 3 primary objectives in the South and Central Asian region. First, we want to support international efforts to stabilize Afghanistan. Secondly, we want to build a strategic partnership with India. And third, we want to build more durable and stable relations with the countries of Central Asia. After describing each of these priorities at greater length, I will focus on some of the energy resources and challenges in Central Asia, which I imagine would be of some interest to all of you in Houston. And then I'd like to also just talk about some of the other countries in South Asia, because each in their own way mark some quite important progress that's occurring in places like Bangladesh and Nepal. First, though, to Afghanistan and Pakistan. My Bureau's single most important priority right now is to support stabilization efforts in Afghanistan. President Obama, Secretary Clinton, Secretary Gates, and virtually all of the other members of the cabinet have spent countless hours reviewing and honing our efforts in that region. And I'm pleased to say that Central Asia and India have played a critical role in supporting coalition efforts in the region. The Northern Distribution Network, or NDN as it's known, runs through most of the Central Asian countries. It supplies a growing percentage of the supplies and provisions for our military effort in Afghanistan. And it offers an alternative to the more widely used southern route that goes through Pakistan. The NDN increasingly offers the people of the Central Asian countries the opportunity to sell goods and services to NATO troops in Afghanistan. And we hope that it can help to catalyze greater trade and economic cooperation between Afghanistan and Central Asia. Even beyond the NDN, the Central Asian nations have underpinned our efforts to fight the Taliban and rebuild Afghanistan. Kyrgyzstan hosts the Manas Transit Center, through which most of our troops pass before going into Afghanistan. It also supports refueling missions for coalition forces in Afghanistan. Electricity from Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan provides the lights for Kabul, while the completion of a railhead in Mazar-e-Sharif in northern Afghanistan this year will link the Uzbek and Afghan railway systems for the first time. Cultivating broad and long-lasting relationships with the Central Asian countries is the only way to ensure a common understanding and gain their long-term support for our efforts in Afghanistan. The United States hopes that the Afghanistan-Pakistan Transit Trade Agreement, which will enter into force on February 11th, will also lead to increased trade between Afghanistan and its northern neighbors, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, and Turkmenistan. Further afield, we also see the agreement as opening an opportunity for India and Pakistan to ramp up their commercial engagement. South Asian countries have also provided important international support to help rebuild Afghanistan. Bangladesh's largest non-governmental organization, called BRAC, runs activities in all of Afghanistan's 34 provinces. India has been a major contributor to reconstruction in Afghanistan, with more than $1.3 billion in assistance so far, including the construction of highways, electricity transmission lines, and the building of Afghanistan's new parliament. As a sign of our close partnership in the region, President Obama announced during his landmark visit to India last November that we would work with India on women's empowerment and capacity building in Afghanistan, the first of important trilateral cooperation that we're engaging with India in on a global scale. These projects with India in Afghanistan mark a small but very important part of a significant new global development, the emergence of a global strategic partnership between the United States and India. As President Obama said in his November 8th speech to the Indian Parliament, quote, "For the first time ever, our governments are working together across the whole range of common challenges that we face. Let me say it as clearly as I can. The United States not only welcomes India as a rising global power, we fervently support it, and we have worked to make it a reality," unquote. India's democracy, diversity, and knowledge-based society make it special, a model of a tolerant, pluralistic society in the region, and one that now actively seeks to work with the United States and others to help solve problems on the global level. Growing ties between our societies, our economies, and our governments have helped sustain and accelerate India's rise. The nearly 3 million Indian Americans in this country, including many from the Houston area, provide a powerful connection between us, as do the more than 100,000 Indian students who are now here at U.S. universities. Bilateral trade between our two countries has tripled in the last decade, creating jobs and opportunities for both of us. Cooperation in counterterrorism and defense modernization is at unprecedented levels. The strength of India's economy makes it the powerhouse of South and Central Asia. India's economy grew at about 7.4% in 2010, making it the second fastest growing economy in the world. and it is expected to be the world's third largest economy by the year 2025, behind only the United States and China. Its middle class now numbers 300 million people and is expected to double over the next 20 years, at which point the middle class alone in India will be roughly the size of the entire population of Western Europe. India's growing economic power has also made it among the fastest growing investors in the United States. Over the last decade, investment from India to the United States grew at an annualized rate of 53%, reaching an estimated $4.4 billion in 2009. Engagement across the U.S. and Indian governments has never been as robust and as comprehensive as it is today. The President's dramatic visit to India highlighted the vast ties between our two countries and our cooperation on such issues ranging from climate change to counterterrorism, nonproliferation, and energy cooperation. President Obama acknowledged India's growing role in the world by endorsing for the first time India for a permanent seat on the UN Security Council. Our people-to-people linkages likewise have grown tremendously. During his stop in Mumbai, President Obama announced business and defense deals that exceeded $14.9 billion, with $9.6 billion in U.S. export content, supporting the creation of over 50,000 jobs in this country. Texas has played a crucial role in furthering our partnership. While I served as our deputy ambassador at our embassy in New Delhi in 2005, Houston-headquartered Continental Airlines was the very first American carrier to start direct flights between New Delhi and the United States. The large Indian diaspora here also illustrates the personal ties here that do so much to catalyze better relations between our countries. We will build on the President's visit in the coming year through an intensive program that includes high-profile visits, such as Hillary Clinton's expected visit to India in April, and even greater engagement. Of particular note, we are welcoming the opportunity to work more closely with India during its 2-year term now on the UN Security Council. On the business side, Commerce Secretary Locke will travel to India in February to attend Aero India, the biannual Indian aerial fair that has grown in importance as India itself has grown. India will soon announce the winners of a tender worth up to $12 billion to supply 126 medium multi-range combat aircraft, a competition in which both Boeing and Lockheed Martin have entered their jets. Secretary Clinton and other cabinet officials will also travel to India for the U.S.-India Strategic Dialogue, which oversees the entire spectrum of our cooperation. I could go into great length at all of our joint activities, but it would take more than the entire speech that I have here today. But let me just say that what we ultimately aim to do is to develop the habits of cooperation that establish a partnership that will shape the 21st century in a way that can bring peace and prosperity to the world. Let me talk a little bit about Central Asia, and particularly the energy opportunities there. We also aim to expand our cooperation and engagement with Central Asia. President Obama's and Secretary Clinton's successful reset of our relations with Russia have given us the political space to engage more deeply in the region without sparking fears of a new great game. In fact, U.S.-Russian cooperation on Central Asia has never been closer. In April 2010, for example, we worked very closely together to respond to the political and humanitarian crisis in Kyrgyzstan, which prompted an unprecedented joint statement by President Obama and President Medvedev in Moscow. We are now looking at new cooperation in areas such as counter-narcotics to complement our political dialogue. Throughout our history and its history, Central Asia has acted as the strategic crossroads, linking China to Russia and Europe to South Asia. The countries themselves have embraced their growing role in determining world events. Kazakhstan just completed its tenure as the chairman of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, during which it hosted a summit, the first OSCE summit in 10 years, that reaffirmed the Helsinki Principles, which outline basic human rights that are expected in post-Soviet Eurasia. In 2011, Kazakhstan has assumed the chairmanship of the Organization for the Islamic Countries, giving it an influential role in this key gathering of Islamic nations. Kyrgyzstan emerged as Central Asia's very first parliamentary democracy last year, and President Berdimuhamedov in Turkmenistan almost single-handedly resurrected the Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, India natural gas pipeline, which, if successful, will finally link the energy resources of Central Asia with the huge and growing energy markets of South Asia. More on the TAPI pipeline later. To use the window of opportunity to establish a deeper and broader dialogue with each of the Central Asian countries, the State Department has established annual bilateral consultations that I lead each year with the foreign ministers of these countries. In each of those that we've held, we engage in frank discussions about the full range of our common interests, from trade to democracy to human rights, defense cooperation, to regional issues such as Afghanistan. I look forward to starting the second round of these annual consultations with Uzbekistan next month in Tashkent. Given your university's location here in Houston, you have undoubtedly interest in the energy opportunities, so I thought I'd just briefly speak about some of those in each of the Central Asian countries. Starting with Kazakhstan. Kazakhstan is arguably the economic powerhouse of Central Asia. President Nazarbayev's decision to invite major oil companies to develop the country's vast hydrocarbon resources in the 1990s was a game changer for Kazakhstan's future. Already a significant oil producer, Kazakhstan will account for one of the largest increases in non-OPEC supply to the global market in the next 10 to 15 years, as its oil production doubles to reach 3 million barrels per day by 2020. Ensuring that this oil reaches world markets is crucial. Such a rapid increase in production will force the Kazakh government, major oil companies, and investors to work fairly quickly to establish new export routes for the additional volumes of oil. This will require a range of political and economic negotiations as well as significant infrastructure development. The Kazakh government has indicated that it may seek to retroactively change the terms of contracts already signed. Such actions would significantly damage Kazakhstan's credibility and reputation with potential foreign investors. So the United States will continue to work very closely with the government of Kazakhstan to ensure the best possible trade and investment climate for our companies in that important country. Turning to Uzbekistan. Uzbekistan is often overlooked as an energy source, but it has substantial hydrocarbon reserves of its own and produces almost as much natural gas as Turkmenistan. Located at the heart of Central Asia, much of the region's infrastructure, roads, railroads, transmission lines, and pipelines go through Uzbekistan, offering it a unique opportunity to expand its exports with very little investment in new infrastructure. Uzbekistan currently exports gas to Russia, Tajikistan, Kazakhstan, and Kyrgyzstan. The natural gas pipeline between Turkmenistan and China crosses Uzbekistan's territory, making exports to China possible for the first time. Finally, in Turkmenistan, after over a decade of near isolation under former President Niyazov, Turkmenistan is slowly opening up to the world. The country's substantial natural resources may make Turkmenistan one of the world's top 5 countries in terms of gas reserves. These reserves have attracted the attention of many countries, including the United States, interested in securing Turkmen gas for various pipeline projects. The recently opened Turkmenistan-China gas pipeline was an important step in enhancing Turkmenistan's economic security by diversifying its export routes. Turkmenistan's initiative to send natural gas to India through Afghanistan and Pakistan through the TAPI pipeline that I mentioned would further reduce its reliance on a single energy market. The United States has welcomed the renewed interest in TAPI, although the challenges to completing such a project are numerous and real. The project would require a multi-billion-dollar investment to build a pipeline that would cross volatile areas of Afghanistan and Pakistan, as well as the tense border between Pakistan and India. Despite these difficulties, there's been recent progress on TAPI, and important steps continue on the part of the participating governments. The presidents of Turkmenistan, Pakistan, Afghanistan, and the Minister of Petroleum of India signed an intergovernmental agreement on the pipeline on December 11th of 2010. Now these governments will begin to discuss issues such as pricing and transit terms. This suggests renewed interest and political will to move forward with the TAPI pipeline project, which has been under discussion since the 1990s. If realized, it would provide revenue and jobs for Afghanistan at a critical time in Afghanistan's economic development. It would also provide clean fuel to the growing economies of Pakistan and India, and its route may serve as a peace corridor, linking neighbors together in economic growth and prosperity. The road ahead for this project is still long, but the benefits could be tremendous and are certainly worthy of the diligence and interest that each of the countries are showing. Complementing the TAPI project, the U.S. has worked with the World Bank on an initiative to take advantage of Central Asia's lower production costs for hydroelectricity and South Asia's insatiable hunger for new energy. The Central Asia-South Asia megawatt project, known as CASA 1000, envisions building a transmission line to export summer surplus from Central Asia to Afghanistan and Pakistan. Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan would benefit from the sale of surplus electricity to these countries. Afghanistan would have the secondary benefit of charging transit fees for energy exported to Pakistan. The four countries have agreed to explore the technical and commercial potential for this project. The benefits of the CASA project would be transformational for all of the participating countries, and we are encouraged the project is moving forward and want it to do so, and want it to do in a very sound and transparent manner. The CASA 1000 project has the potential to build on what is a small but growing electricity trade between Central Asia and South Asia. Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan already export electricity to Afghanistan, and these imports have resulted in a noticeable increase in northern Afghanistan's electricity supply, particularly in Kabul. A review of my bureau would not be complete without mentioning some of the other South Asian countries that neighbor India: Sri Lanka, Nepal, Bangladesh, Bhutan, and the Maldives. The growth of India has overshadowed the progress that has been made in each of these countries. Bangladesh, for example, has experienced an average growth rate of 6% over the last 18 years, which has helped lift millions of Bangladeshis out of poverty. Houston, with its large Bangladeshi diaspora community, has undoubtedly contributed to the $11 billion in global remittances that Bangladesh receives each year. And Bangladesh, with its inclusive growth model and newly stable government, represents another potential powerhouse in the South Asian neighborhood. The recent investigation into the Nobel Prize-winning Grameen Bank, however, has raised concerns. Secretary Clinton has urged the government to maintain its democratic values and to ensure that its investigation is impartial and balanced. Nepal and Sri Lanka have both ended terrible internal conflicts in the last few years, but each must now secure the peace. In Kathmandu last week, the UN mission in Nepal withdrew after 4 years, putting responsibility for completing Nepal's peace process squarely in the hands of Nepal's political parties. I spoke with Prime Minister Nepal last week and the Maoist chairman to tell them that the United States government will continue to support the peace process in Nepal. I urged all of the parties to continue to respect their own commitments under the Comprehensive Peace Agreement and said it is incumbent upon them to bring peace now to a conclusion. While Sri Lanka's economy has thrived since the end of its brutal civil war in May of 2009, a period during which I served as ambassador there, the reconciliation process has proceeded slowly. The United States hopes that the government will act on the recommendations of the Lessons Learned and Reconciliation Commission that the government set up as part of wider efforts that will be needed to help establish a lasting peace. South Asia's smallest countries, Bhutan and Maldives, both experienced peaceful transitions to democracy in 2008. And so for the first time in South Asia's history, every country in South Asia had a democratically elected government. The Bhutanese model of gross national happiness has shaped new thinking about economic growth in developing countries, and Bhutan is one of the few developing countries in the world on track to achieve all of its Millennium Development Goals by 2015. And the moderate Muslim nation of the Maldives, now led by a former Amnesty International prisoner of conscience, has punched above its weight in the global debate on climate change and thought of innovative ways to illustrate the plight of its sinking atolls. The cabinet meeting that it held underwater last year captured the attention of the world, and was probably the first and only time that a cabinet meeting will ever be held underwater. So in conclusion, I oversee a region that I cannot do justice to in 20 or 30 minutes. And while the region's diversity opens many opportunities, it also presents a challenge in our efforts to encourage all of these disparate countries to work together. We have many obstacles to overcome, but I hope that our effort to rebuild Afghanistan and develop deeper relations throughout the region will contribute to this vision. So again, I want to just express my very warm thanks to Ed for inviting me here today, and I'd be very glad to take whatever questions you might have. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Bob. The floor is open to questions. This event is simultaneously webcast, so I want to give you a warning. Whatever you say will go throughout the world. But with that, in fact, please, Charles Foster.
Yeah, Secretary Blake, thank you for coming. On Pakistan, just a two-part question. The stability of the government, it was almost brought down, I understand, with the withdrawal of one of the coalition partners, and whether that, what that means for the future. And just to comment on the what appeared to me, the inability of the political leadership to comment on the recent assassination of the governor would seem to, there were, in terms of the tone, that where that was being celebrated widely but within certain circles, and there didn't seem to be any counterbalance to that.
Yeah. Well, I think people have been projecting that the president's coalition would fall for some time, and it hasn't happened. So, I mean, you'll see that I think the President Zardari is a survivor, and I think that his government will hold together. But certainly they do face challenges, and I think one of the very big challenges they face is exactly what you put your finger on, the sort of growing militarization that you see in some parts of Pakistani society. And that's part of, I think, a wider set of challenges that they face on the economic front as well, on meeting some of their energy needs, and most particularly in confronting terrorism. Pakistan is the country that has been hurt the worst of any country in the world by terrorism. And it's something that is not a well-known factor around the world. So they confront not only this issue of how to stop the murderous activities of groups like the Pakistani Taliban, who are targeting Pakistanis, but also how to make progress in the sanctuaries, which are of such immense strategic importance to the United States. And I think you've seen that there's been some progress. They have moved into Swat, they moved into South Waziristan, but there's still more progress that needs to be made. I think you all saw the results of the review that the President conducted in December of last year, in which they specifically talked about that progress, but also said that we need to see more progress in areas like North Waziristan, where many of the groups like the Haqqani Network that target American troops in Afghanistan are based. I think the government wants to do more in that area, the government of Pakistan, but also faces some very real capacity issues that they've got to deal with. Those have not been helped by unexpected challenges such as the floods, the terrible floods that they experienced last year, and now most recently this earthquake that just took place 2 days ago. So it's a country that is of just immense strategic importance to the United States. We have devoted considerable resources to that country, and the President, I think, works harder on this than almost any other country, and is very, very focused on making progress. The next big milestone in relations will be to have trilateral meetings that will take place in about a month and a half in Washington, where the leaders of those countries will come together in Washington to make further progress and, again, try to get more cooperation between Afghanistan and Pakistan, as well as with the United States. So this will continue to be just a tremendously important priority for the United States. And again, from my perspective, my small part of it is trying to work on the Indo-Pakistani part of it, and then again, encouraging the Central Asians to be as supportive as possible in terms of allowing the transit of goods for our troops and for other NATO coalition troops into Afghanistan. So I think we've made a lot of progress, but as the review concluded, there's still a lot of very important work to be done, and the progress that has been made is fragile.
Secretary Blake, Ambassador Blake, my name is Radu Filip. I have a question to you, please. It's a long time ago it was established that population growth drives economic growth.
Yes.
But do you see a link, a correlation between population growth and terrorism in a part of the world which is more crowded than ever? Thank you.
It depends on whether there are the jobs there to provide income and opportunity for those people. And so I would say in a place like Tajikistan now, a very large percentage of the young male population in Tajikistan works outside of the country because there are not sufficient jobs inside Tajikistan. So they're actually very fortunate that there are those jobs in places like Russia. And so remittances account for roughly half of the GDP of Tajikistan. So that has provided a very important safety valve. But not all countries are so fortunate. Pakistan is a good example of that. Pakistan has a population of about 175 million people. Its population is going to double over the next 20 years to 350 million people. So they are already having challenges providing employment opportunities for their existing population. I think one of the best opportunities to create job growth for them will come through greater trade with India. As I said earlier, India is going to become the third largest economy in the world by the year 2025. It's growing at a very impressive clip that is likely to be sustained over the long term at 7, 8, 9, 10% growth. So it is very much in Pakistan's interest to have better relations with India. And it's very much in India's interest to help stabilize Pakistan. And that's a point that the President made repeatedly during his trip to India in November. So one of our most important priorities is to do what we can to encourage that. But really, in the final analysis, it's up to those two countries, those two partners of the United States, to try to reach an agreement on the steps forward that are needed to improve relations. We're encouraged that they've announced that there's going to be meetings at first the foreign secretary level, so that's sort of just below the minister level, in Thimphu, in Bhutan, in early February, which I think will mark another very important opportunity to discuss the way forward, and perhaps the ministers will meet there too. Kind of the big obstacle so far has been to, from the Indian perspective, is to get the Pakistanis to prosecute those responsible for the Mumbai attacks on 26/11 in 2008. And that we hope some progress can be made on that, because I think that would then unlock quite a lot of new opportunities, such as the trade opportunities that I talked about.
First of all, I'd just like to thank you very much for coming here to the Baker Institute and also for your service to this country. One of the priorities of the Obama administration has been to create jobs. And let me just tell you, as a graduating senior, soon entering the job market, I really appreciate that. But there are a lot of jobs right now that are going to your region that you represent. And I was wanting to know if there's any type of disincentives that the Obama administration is considering putting in place for corporations that are thinking about sending jobs overseas that would maybe try to give them incentive to keep them here. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I'm going to answer that in two ways. First of all, I encourage you and all the other students in the audience to think about a career in the Foreign Service and working for and I say that in a very serious way, because it's a wonderful opportunity for young people and for old people like me to really make a difference. And I came from a Foreign Service family. My dad was also in the Foreign Service, so I grew up in Africa and places like that. I never dreamed that I would actually end up in the Foreign Service, but perhaps reflects my lack of imagination. But I will tell you, though, that I've never regretted a single day of my life working in the Foreign Service, because every day of my life has been different, and every day of my life has been exciting and filled with opportunities to make a difference in people's lives in all of the countries that I've served. And if I had a chance to do it all over again, I would do it again, and I would go to the same countries I went to. Perhaps I'd do a little bit more in China, because I think China is going to be a really important country for us in the world of the 21st century. But I do seriously encourage all of you to think about a career in the Foreign Service. There's no cost. You can take the Foreign Service exam on a yearly basis and take it as many times as you need to. I had one guy in my class who took it 8 times before he finally passed it. He's turned out to be a great Foreign Service officer, which means maybe they have to look at the exam. But to answer your other question, though, I think one of the most notable developments in terms of our trade with India has been the increased balance of our trade. I mentioned in the course of my speech that now the levels of Indian investment in the United States and the job creation that they are creating here almost equals what we are doing in India. And it's really a tribute to the balanced growth that they have been pursuing. And to the growth of the Indian private sector there, which is really led by innovation and, again, very open markets, but an open environment that allows innovation to thrive. And they have the Indian development model is a very unusual one, where service growth has really led the overall GDP growth. It's very unusual for a developing country, and so we really do see that this is a balanced partnership. So there really aren't the pressures that you talked about to try to restrict outsourcing, things like that. Most of the American companies are not so much exporting jobs, they're doing research and development to take advantage of the brain power that exists in India and to work much more closely with those companies. But I do think if you were to do a serious analysis, and they had, and Indian firms have done some of this, you'd find that the job creation in the United States by Indian firms almost equals that, and probably over time that's going to continue to grow as the Indian economy grows. So it's a good story that we have to tell, and something that the president talked a lot about. It doesn't mean that we're not doing pretty well. I mean, the growing Indian market is also important for us, as I said. The president announced $10 billion worth of exports, or $15 billion, but the export content of it was $10 billion. That was 50,000 jobs by itself, and huge new contracts are on the horizons. So I think you're going to continue to see a lot of major opportunities to create further jobs. And as you say, the president is very, very focused on this, and so we're looking now at ways that we can, again, capitalize on that through things like bilateral investment treaties and whatever we can do to, again, help American companies to export more to big and emerging markets like India.
Is there a policy change between Iran and Afghanistan now that Iran is holding up 2,500 fuel trucks at the Afghan border?
I didn't hear the first part of your question. I was coughing. I apologize.
Is there a policy change between Iran and Afghanistan now that Iran is holding 2,500 fuel trucks?
Yes, there's been a lot of tensions about that. Obviously, the Afghans have been deeply concerned. The Iranians have held up some of those fuel supplies because they believe that the fuel is going to NATO troops. My sense is that the two countries will get beyond this because Iran has some quite important interests in Afghanistan, as we all do. But you make predictions about Iran at your peril, so I'm not going to try to make too many predictions about what they're going to try to do.
Would you take a question about Turkey?
You know, I'm not really much of an expert on Turkey anymore. It's been about 10 years. I'd prefer not to talk on the record about that. But well, we can talk afterwards. How about that?
We have the Consul General. Consul General is here, so.
Welcome.
Yes.
Yes, sir. Recently, the Afghan Parliament, I guess it's the beginning of the new parliament.
Can you speak up? Yeah.
Yes. The Afghan Parliament was recently, the startup was delayed for a month by President Karzai. Do you see any implications for the stability of Karzai's government due to this 1 month delay in the start of Parliament?
No, I don't think it's going to have any long-term effects on stability. But it is a continuing, it is an important focus of our mission in Afghanistan to encourage that process so that the Parliament can be seated. They were, as you know, it's now been, I think, about 5 months since the elections took place. So I think that is an important part of the whole democratization process. But I don't think it's going to have any long-term effect on stability.
Yes, ma'am.
In your talk, you mentioned several defense deals between the U.S. and nations in South and Central Asia.
Yes.
And I was wondering if you could talk more broadly about collaboration in science and technology in this area, and specifically about any changes the Obama administration might be considering in export control policy to help enhance or enable more broad collaboration.
That's a great question. Just to start with India, because that's always the biggest market. One of the very important announcements that the president made during his trip was to remove several Indian research companies, particularly the Indian Space Research Organization and the Defense Research and Development Organization, DRDO, from what's called the entities list, which prohibits our companies from doing business with them. So those, I think, are going to open up some quite significant opportunities for American companies, both in the space and in the defense area, and are very timely because of some of these very large contracts that are coming up. Approximately $20 billion of contracts in the defense area will be announced just in the next 2 years in India. It shows that it's one of the largest markets in the world. Interestingly, the Indians are not so much focused on Pakistan, they're more focused on China and the extraordinary growth that's taking place in China as well on the military front. So I think our companies see some quite important opportunities there. In the past, there has been some concern about the quite restrictive offset policy that the Indians have maintained. Just very recently, they liberalized that, which I think is going to allow for investments in areas like civil aerospace and things like that. So that's a very welcome development. Another thing that will be very important is if they open up the defense industry to greater foreign investment. And I think they're looking at that, but that could be quite a controversial initiative. And right now, the Indian Parliament is very, very divided. So I think the government will proceed cautiously in that particular area. But again, we do see important opportunities. And on the broader science and technology front, President Obama, as part of his efforts to try to engage the Muslim world, has really made science and technology one of the pillars of that engagement, I think, and it's been in a very clever way. And we have signed science and technology agreements with Kazakhstan and with Uzbekistan. And both of them feel that there's some quite significant opportunities. So my colleague who handles science and technology at the State Department, Carrie Ann Jones, is going to be going out to both of those countries to really think through an action plan of how we can begin serious science and technology cooperation. And I think there really are very big opportunities. Of course, in India, we're already doing a tremendous amount, but it's encouraging to see that we're opening kind of new S&T markets as well. And it's a part of these wider efforts that I talked about to try to expand our efforts in Central Asia.
Bin Laden, supposedly he's somewhere in your region. I'm wondering if you have any comments on, that you can share publicly about the hunt for Bin Laden. And
yes, I'm here to announce today.
and you have a specific address and how his alleged presence in your region affects any of the diplomatic and security dynamics in the region.
No, I don't think any of us know where bin Laden is. I mean, I think we all assume that he's somewhere in those border regions still, in Pakistan and Afghanistan. But if we knew, believe me, we'd go after him. So there were quite intensive efforts underway. But I think bin Laden has been a little bit marginalized because the whole movement has expanded so much and metastasized, if you will. And so increasingly our focus has been on a lot of these groups that are based in the safe havens that are directly targeting America. And so those are really our primary focus. And those are Al-Qaeda, but also a lot of Al-Qaeda related groups like the Haqqani group that I mentioned that are not only targeting our troops, but other groups that potentially could target our homeland. So, of course, those are going to be very, very important preoccupations of ours. And beyond that, I can't really comment.
Secretary Blake, it seems to me that a country like Kazakhstan particularly represents a very delicate challenge for us because we have enormous technical and energy potential. On the other hand, you're dealing with Nazarbayev. I mean, are we proactive in trying to bring this person towards more democratization so that we don't face, there'll be regime change someday there, and you'll have a person that just goes floating out, a regime that goes floating into the ether with no political infrastructure behind it, just one person, a family, so to speak. Are we proactive in trying to bring about democratization in countries like that?
We are, not just there, but in all of the Central Asian countries. Kazakhstan's a bit of a special case because, as I mentioned, they were the first country east of Vienna to ever become the head of the OSCE, what they call the chairman in office of the OSCE for a year in 2010. As part of our support for their candidacy, we really encourage progress particularly in elections and in the media environment and in freedom of association, all of which are very, very important parts of the democratization picture. And I think there has been progress in all those areas. And Secretary Clinton talked about those publicly when she was there in December. But it's, I must say, since then, there's been a bit of a slide, particularly, as you may have heard, there's been a referendum petition that has been signed by more than half of the population of Kazakhstan. More than 5 million people have signed this petition to essentially cancel the planned elections for 2012 and make President Nazarbayev president until 2020, which we obviously do not think is a good idea. And we have said so publicly that we believe strongly in the value of elections and that elections are a way for leaders to explain themselves and their policies to their people and to allow contenders to also challenge them and to provide their own alternative visions. Nazarbayev's a bit of a special case, as I said, because it's in this case it's really not needed. He has overwhelming support. I think if there were to be truly free and fair elections, I think he would win hands down, because he is a popular leader and people feel that he has really brought a lot of progress to Kazakhstan. So this is an area of disagreement between our countries, and we will talk about it very frankly. Secretary Clinton's going to host the Foreign Minister of the Foreign Minister of Kazakhstan, Mr. Sadabayev, next week in Washington. I'm sure this will be at or near the top of the agenda to talk about this. And the Secretary, as she always does, will be very forthright publicly about our thoughts on this subject. But we've already made our thoughts known in Kazakhstan about this as well. More broadly, I think Central Asia has experienced kind of ups and downs on the democracy front. As I mentioned in my speech, Kyrgyzstan had the region's first ever free and fair parliamentary elections in its history, which are quite an important achievement for that country. But at the same time, a lot of the other leaders of Central Asia looked at what happened in Central Asia, at what happened in Kyrgyzstan, and were quite concerned. And we're very concerned that they don't want to see a wave of democratization. They're very worried about the trends in Afghanistan. They're very worried that as our troops make progress in southern Afghanistan, more and more of the Taliban and others will move north and potentially into Central Asia. So they're following that very closely, as are we. So we're working with them on border security and counter-narcotics and a variety of other efforts to help protect them. But they also worry that there could be greater challenges to their own regimes. And so we have quite an important dialogue with them to encourage them to provide more space, more religious freedom, more political space, greater freedom of the internet, freedom of the media, allow NGOs to organize. And in many cases, they don't agree with that. They think that they're suspicious of those kind of reforms and believe that the best way to is to keep tight control on these things. And we actually think that can be destabilizing. So this is a sort of continuing dialogue that we have to try to, again, provide greater openings, provide greater space, which we think actually will help the situation. But it's emblematic of the kind of dialogue that we have, which is respectful, but also, insistent, I would say, about the need for progress. And and one of the things that what we've tried to do in all of these annual consultations that I have is to have an NGO component, so that on the second day we invite local NGOs. If it's in Washington, we have Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International and others come in. And if it's there, we'll invite local NGOs in, and we just have a very frank, off-the-record dialogue about whatever they want to talk about. And I think it's quite helpful and quite useful.
Last question. Well, I have two. One. Okay.
Secretary Blake, you mentioned that Pakistan as the country that's mostly affected by terrorism in the world. Given its nuclear capabilities.
Sorry, Pakistan? You said
Pakistan, yes. Given its nuclear capabilities, what's the United States government assessment of the risks of those nuclear arms getting in the hands of terrorists in Pakistan?
President Obama has talked about this several times and expressed confidence in the ability of the Pakistanis to manage their nuclear assets. So we don't see that as a huge concern.
Last question goes to the military.
Sir, I've spent some time in Afghanistan working a reintegration process, which relies on a lot of different organizations.
Yeah.
And the efforts in Afghanistan depend not only on state, but on agriculture, DEA, all these other organizations. Right. What has the Obama administration done beyond the current civilian surge to try to encourage some other interagency partners and NGOs and other organizations to become involved in Afghanistan and Central Asia?
Well, as the gentleman said, there's been a huge civilian surge, I think unprecedented in our history in terms of the State Department in getting what we now have almost 1,000 civilians on the ground in Afghanistan. And they're not just from the State Department, from the Department of Agriculture, the U.S. Agency for International Development, the Drug Enforcement Agency, and many other agencies. The primary focus has been on agriculture because, of course, that's been the base of the Afghan economy for so many years. And we do believe there's significant opportunities to increase agricultural production, provide more jobs for Afghans, and to essentially reestablish what once was a very thriving agricultural economy before all of this violence started. So I'd say we're not so much looking to expand that further. We're looking to kind of make sure that now all of those folks that are on the ground have the tools they need and can begin to actually work and deliver results. And so that's going to be I think the big focus for the next year or two or three. And then, you know, we'll make an assessment about what more is needed and if more people are needed. But I think now there's a very large number of people on the ground. So it's not so much a question of personnel, but it's a question now of getting all of the, working much more closely with our Afghan partners to develop the infrastructure, to make sure that the incentives are right, to reduce corruption, to improve governance, and to do all of those very complex things that are part of the larger puzzle of increasing agricultural production and providing more opportunity for the Afghan people. And so I think that's really where you're going to see sort of a continued focus. And, you know, I think, as I said, the assessment from the military leaders is that progress is being made in southern Afghanistan, and we'll obviously continue to sustain that progress. But there will also be, as you say, this very important effort of reintegration, which is to try to lure kind of lower level Talibans away from the Taliban by providing them with economic opportunities so they can go back to their families and stop fighting. Because our assessment is that a lot of these lower level Taliban are not necessarily fighting for ideological reasons, but, you know, for opportunistic reasons, that they get paid by the Taliban, and so they go and do that. But if they're not too many people want to fight and be away from their families for too long. So if you can give them a better alternative, we should do that. And that's exactly what we're trying to do with the reintegration program that is led by the Afghans, but assisted by the American military and our folks on the ground. There will then be a very important reconciliation effort that will take place as well, that will also be led by the Afghans. And that will be to try to convince some of the higher level Taliban to stop fighting. And we've set out some conditions for that, which would be that those that participate would have to renounce violence, would have to renounce ties with al-Qaeda, and would most importantly have to respect the Afghan constitution. And so that effort is sort of really now beginning. And I think you'll see a greater and greater focus on that, because everybody realizes that in the end, there will have to be a political solution to the situation in Afghanistan. But the purpose of the military effort is to convince the Taliban to come to the table so that they don't think that they can just win and outlast the NATO coalition. And again, I think General Petraeus and his team are making very good progress, and now want to try to sustain that progress, which will provide, I think, the incentive for this nascent reconciliation process.
Thank you very much.